they planted a church here where there was none, now there was one. It was time well spent and a spiritually profitable visit, even if they did have to flee the city to avoid a beating. So Paul is literally being harassed by a crazy demon-possessed woman, and it takes him several days to lose patience with her. What about giants, or the Illuminati, or aliens, or what secret thing is happening in Jerusalem, or the secret railroad running under the earth? Have you heard of that one? I just heard about that one the other day. Good morning, friends. Welcome to God's Sabbath. Please turn with me to 1 Thessalonians chapter 2, verse 1. 1 Thessalonians chapter 2, verse 1. Last time we finished the first chapter of Thessalonians, so today we're going to start on the second. In the first chapter, Paul praised their faithfulness, even in the midst of severe persecution, and the joy with which they endured it. He painted a picture of an assembly that had made God the desire of their soul. And because of that, they were able to be an example to all the other congregations in Macedonia. Now in chapter 2, Paul gets into his own ministry and the sort of conduct he and his fellows held during the time they spent with these people. He's going to relate the example they set and how, during their time in Thessalonica, they took no money from these people and rather worked with their own hands to support themselves. He's also going to remind them how they received the message they brought, not as mere words of men, but as the very words of God. So the pattern of the second chapter is very similar to the pattern of the first chapter, and that's something Paul does a lot in his writing. He uses a lot of parallelism to get his point across. And once again, he'll end this chapter looking forward to the return of Jesus. So if the first chapter was Paul's commendation of their example and the way they were living, the second chapter is his reminder of why they have the example they have, and for them not to forget where they came from, so they don't stray off of the true way. So 1 Thessalonians chapter 2, verse 1. And these are the words of our living God. For you have known, brothers, that our entrance to you has not been in vain. But having both suffered before, and having been mistreated, as you have known, in Philippi we were bold in our God to speak to you the good news of God in much conflict. For our exhortation is not out of deceit, nor out of uncleanness, nor in guile. But as we have been approved by God to be entrusted with the good news, so we speak, not as pleasing men, but God, who is proving our hearts. For at no time did we come with speech of flattery, as you have known, nor in a pretext for covetousness, God is witness, nor seeking glory from men, neither from you nor from others, being able to be burdensome as Christ's apostles. But we became gentle in your midst, as a nurse may nurture her own children. So being desirous of you, we are well pleased to impart to you not only the good news of God, but also our own souls, because you have become beloved to us. For you remember, brothers, our labor and travail, for working night and day, not to be a burden to any of you. We preached the good news of God to you. You are witnesses, God also, how piously and righteously and blamelessly we became to you who believe. Even as you have known how we are exhorting each one of you, as a father his own children, and comforting and testifying, for you're walking worthily of God, who is calling you to his own kingdom and glory. So that concludes our section of chapter 2 of 1 Thessalonians. We're now going to go back and go through it in more detail, since we have the overview of the whole section. So Paul is continuing his thoughts from chapter 1, once again addressing the brothers of Thessalonica and introducing the main topic of his chapter, which is the manner of entrance the apostles had, that is, the visit they made, and the time they spent with these people. Verse 1, "For you have known, brothers, that our entrance to you has not been in vain." So the time they spent was not in vain because it produced a brand new assembly and brand new followers of the way. Right? They planted a church here where there was none, now there was one. It was time well spent and a spiritually profitable visit, even if they did have to flee the city to avoid a beating. So in the next verse, Paul drops a tidbit of information on the background of why they were bold to speak to these people, even in the midst of persecution. 1 Thessalonians 2, verse 2. "But having both suffered before, and having been mistreated, as you have known, in Philippi, we were bold in our God to speak to you the good news of God in much conflict." So it's interesting. As you have known, he says this several times and also appeals to as God is witness. So there we have two witnesses. It's an appeal to a known and shared history. They knew this story. So he's reminding them of that. But what happened in Philippi? Well, since the events in Philippi are the catalyst for their boldness in Macedonia, we're going to go back and look at what occurred during their visit there. Acts 16, starting in verse 11. "Whatever happened in Philippi must have built some faith in these men. And indeed, when we go back and look at what happened, we find exactly that sort of experience. It's pretty amazing, really." Verse 11 of Acts 16. "Having set sail, therefore, from Troas, we came with a straight course to Samothracia, on the next day also to Neapolis, there also to Philippi, which is a principal city of the part of Macedonia, a colony, and we were abiding in the city some days. On the day of the Sabbaths, we also went forth outside of the city, by a river, where there used to be prayer, and having sat down, we were speaking to the women who came together. And a certain woman, by name Lydia, a seller of purple, of the city of Thyatira, worshipping God, was hearing, whose heart the Lord opened to attend to the things spoken by Paul. And when she was immersed, and her household, she called on us, saying, If you have judged me to be faithful to the Lord, having entered into my house, remain. And she constrained us." So the first converts to the way in Philippi were a group of women. Now what's interesting about this is that there was apparently no Jewish synagogue in Philippi. No, because if there was, that's where Paul would have gone, right? That was what his habit was. On the Sabbath day, he would go into the synagogue. But there are certain requirements for there to be a synagogue, and one of those requirements is that there are at least 10 Jewish men. That's what I could find online anyway. 10 Jewish men. Well, the only ones we find meeting by the river here, however, are women. They're not Jewish, which tells us the Jewish population of the city was basically non-existent at this point. No, and this is further supported by the fact that Paul received no persecution from Jews during his time here at all. In fact, his persecution is entirely from the Romans. And as we'll see later, the locals also only received persecution from the Romans, not the Jews. Men are going to be added in the plural sense, and that's kind of where we're going with this towards the end. But the first converts to the way in the city are women. And we're, again, going to take a closer look at Lydia when we get to the letter, Paul's letter to Philippi. But she was likely a wealthy Greek widow. It's actually pretty interesting looking at her. She did quite well in trading purple cloth, and she was able and willing to give the apostles a place to stay and financial aid. Now, moving on to verse 16, the trouble for Paul and the men he is traveling with really gets going. And it starts in a very interesting way. "And it came to pass, in our going on to prayer, a certain maid, having a spirit of Python," so a spirit of Python is a unclean spirit, a demon, "met us, who brought much employment to her masters by soothsaying. She, having followed Paul and us, was crying, saying, These men are servants of the Most High God, who declare to us the way of salvation. And she was doing this for many days. But Paul, having been grieved and having turned, said to the Spirit, I command you, in the name of Jesus Christ, to come forth from her. And it came forth in the same hour." So Paul is literally being harassed by a crazy demon-possessed woman, and it takes him several days to lose patience with her. Several days. We have this local fixture in Delta, this crazy woman who walks up and down the street, yelling and cursing at anyone within earshot. And I can honestly say it wouldn't take very many days to lose patience with her. What's also interesting is the fact that Paul did not immediately cast out this demon. That's something we'll see with the apostles and Jesus. They didn't cast out the demon of every possessed person they came across, which is interesting because when you look at what the popular ideas are about demons in many of the churches around us, there is some sort of expectation of a deliverance ministry with a demon hiding practically behind every single sinner. Like, if you're a sinner, you must be possessed. But that's not what we see the apostles or even Jesus doing. Right? There's another idea that came across, which is an idea that if you're saved, if you have God's Spirit in you, you might still be possessed. But we also don't see that in the Bible. So anyways, Paul and Jesus weren't running one of these so-called deliverance ministries, hunting down demon-possessed people to cast out demons. And in fact, the only people we see doing anything like that were some Jewish exorcists referred to as itinerant later in Acts 19. So Paul commands the demon to depart from her, and it does. And there were some men who were profiting off of her being possessed, and this greatly upset them. Verse 19 of Acts 16. And her masters, having seen that the hope of their employment was gone, having caught Paul and Silas, drew them into the marketplace to the rulers. And again, this is not the Jews, right? He didn't get persecuted by Jews in this city. And having brought them to the magistrates, they said, these men, being Jews, okay, so that's another thing. These men thought Paul and Silas and Timothy were Jews. They mistook them for that because of their beliefs in meeting on Sabbath, most likely. Anyways, these men exceedingly trouble our city, and they proclaim customs that are not lawful for us to receive nor to do, being Romans. And the multitude rose up together against them, and the magistrates, having torn their garments from them, were commanding to beat them with rods. So this woman's masters saw their prophets just bloop and got really upset, right? When people start losing money, that's when they get real angry. And so they accuse these men of being Jews, which, from the way they're treated, seems like, number one, they weren't very popular. Number two, it was practically a crime in this city. So the multitude was only too happy to beat them at the magistrate's command. And then after being beaten, they were cast into prison and put into chains. Verse 23. Having also laid on them many blows, they cast them into prison, having given charge to the jailer to keep them safely, who, having received such a charge, put them into the inner prison, and fastened their feet in the stocks. So last time, if you'll remember, we talked about joy in tribulation and trials. And well, here is one of the strongest examples of such a thing in all of Scripture, because these two men were beaten with many blows, which did apparently leave them bloody, right? They weren't just bruises, because they needed their wounds bathed later on. But not only that, then they're cast into prison and put into stocks. And if you've ever seen a picture of stocks, or if you haven't, they're this wooden contraption with holes in the middle where they either stick your feet or your arms and clamp down on top of them. They're a rigid structure. They don't allow much movement. Right? If you're in chains, you can kind of shift around, but not in the stocks. You know how nice it is, like when you're aching on one part of your body, to be able to shift over and give that part a rest? Well, these men couldn't do that. They were imprisoned without the ability to shift around. Sleep in such a position would have been nearly impossible. And in the next verse, we find out they weren't sleeping at all. If it were most men who got beaten, they'd be in there groaning, yelling at the jailer, banging on the bars of their cell, or complaining. But these two guys didn't respond like that. And it's because of who they served. Verse 25. And at midnight, Paul and Silas praying, were singing hymns to God, and the prisoners were hearing them. So these two guys, sitting in prison, aching, bloody, locked up tight, are singing and praying out loud. They're in pain, and they're not only singing and praying out loud, they're singing and praying loud enough that the other prisoners and the jailer can hear them. I'm sure they weren't expecting to get out that night, yet they were filled with joy. How much joy does it take to sing and pray in such a situation out loud? Well, here's a hard question. Why would God allow them to be put into prison like this in the first place? If any of us ended up in prison, we'd probably be like, oh man, why did God allow this to happen? Well, we do have an answer for this in this particular instance. There was a man in this prison God was going to use as one of the seeds to plant an assembly in the city and grow his church. And apparently he too, this man, was able to hear Paul and Silas singing and praying, and his response is going to be without hesitation when the opportunity presents itself, which is something that a lot of the men we see in Scripture who God called had in common. Right? They see what needs to happen, they're told, do this, and they instantly choose to obey. They're decisive. Verse 26. And suddenly a great earthquake came, so that the foundations of the prison were shaken. Also all the doors were immediately opened, and of all the bands were loosed. And the jailer, having come out of sleep, and having seen the doors of the prison open, having drawn a sword, was about to kill himself, supposing the prisoners to have fled. Well, so the jailer's awakened by the earthquake. He supposes that he lost the prisoners while asleep on watch, and he's about to kill himself. That seems like a bit of an overreaction, like, come on, there were just a couple of prisoners. But in the Roman military, if you lost your prisoners, especially while you were asleep, it was your life for theirs. We actually see an example of this in Acts 12, verse 19. This is a time when Peter was sitting in prison in chains, and an angel opened the doors of his cell and took off his chains so he could get out. Acts 12:19. But when Herod had searched for him and not found him, he examined the guards and commanded that they should be put to death. So, 2 guards lost their lives because a prisoner escaped. So this jailer was getting ready to do the same thing, take his own life before he had to be executed. But God did not loosen the prisoner's chains at this time so Paul and Silas could escape. That wasn't why he did it. Not every open door is for us to walk through. And in this particular case, it was an open door for the jailer to come to the knowledge of the truth. Verse 28 of Acts 16. And Paul cried out with a loud voice, saying, You may not do yourself any harm, for we are all here. In other words, none of the prisoners escaped, even though they all had their chains loosened. And having asked for a light, he sprang in, and he fell down before Paul and Silas trembling. And having brought them forth, said, Lords, what must I do that I may be saved? God put Paul and Silas in this prison in the first place to knock on the door of the jailer's heart and get his attention. That's why they were there. And the jailer instantly knew what had happened, what this event meant. Right? He'd been listening to them singing and praying for most of the night. And then this happens, and what's his first question? What must I do that I may be saved? How can I be saved? Paul thinks for a moment and then responds, Well, I want to see you once a week for the next year, and then after that, we'll see about setting up a time for you to get baptized. Oh, not quite. Verse 31. And they said, Believe on the Lord Jesus Christ, and you will be saved, you and your household. Now, in this time, the jailer's residence was often connected to the prison, and in verse 30, the jailer brought them out into the main courtyard area. That's what we saw when he brought them forth. Whereupon, they preached the word of the Lord to him and his household, who had apparently come out into the yard as well. Verse 32. And they spoke to him the word of the Lord and to all those in his household. And having taken them in that hour of the night, he bathed them from the blows, and immediately he and all of his were immersed. So in that same hour of the night, he and his entire household were baptized. Right? Same hour. Then the jailer brings them into his house and feeds them, rejoicing at having found the true God. Verse 34. Having also brought him into his house, he set food before them, and was glad with all the household, he having believed in God. So when I was first looking at this sequence of events, getting ready for this message, it was a little confusing at first, because what's all this bringing forth, and then how did he bathe them, and all of a sudden they're in his house. And in doing the research for that, that's when I discovered that the jailer's residence was quite often connected to the prison, and then there was usually a common courtyard. Oftentimes the residence would even be the second floor of the prison, or something similar like that. So he brings them out into the courtyard. His family comes down, he preaches to them, they bathe his blows, he baptizes with them, and then they go up into the house and share a meal, rejoicing. So the next day, they're still in prison after this. They had to go back into prison. They are about to be released when Paul reveals they are, in fact, both Roman citizens and not Jews, as they supposed. Verse 35. And the day having come, the magistrates sent the rod-bearers, saying, Let those men go. And the jailer told these words to Paul, The magistrates have sent that you may be let go. Now therefore, having gone, go forth in peace. And Paul said to them, Having beaten us publicly uncondemned, men, being Romans, they cast us into prison, and now privately they cast us forth? Why, no. But having come themselves, let them bring us forth. So the rod-bearers go their way back to the magistrates to relay this new piece of information. And it elicits a surprising reaction. Verse 38. And the rod-bearers told these sayings to the magistrates, and they were afraid, having heard that they are Romans. And having come, they implored them, and having brought them forth, they were asking them to go forth from the city. So having Roman citizens beaten without a trial was against the law, and could have meant the magistrate's own death. So they were afraid when they heard that the men they assumed were Jews were actually Romans. So the magistrates listened to Paul. They're like, oh yes, if you're going to go forth from our city, we'll come and personally let you go. And from the sounds of it, it seems like they apologized as well in their imploring. So after being asked personally by the magistrates to leave the city, Paul and Silas stopped by the house of Lydia on their way out of town. And here's where we find out there were more converted in their time than just the jailer. Verse 40. And they, having gone forth out of the prison, entered into the house of Lydia, and having seen the brothers, they comforted them and went forth. So, after all of these adventures, Paul and Silas depart from Philippi and continue on to Thessalonica, emboldened by their experiences to preach the gospel in Thessalonica. They endured beatings, persecution, and ridicule at the hands of the Romans, just because they cast a demon out of a woman and removed someone's income, someone's source of wealth. So they were thrown into prison, which God used as an opportunity to start his church in the area and grow it. They got a very valuable lesson while there, namely, God was with them, and even being thrown into prison was according to his purpose. They endured outrageous treatment and suffering. And they themselves learned how to endure with joy this outrageous treatment, as though for a moment. And they themselves learned more perfectly just what sort of God they were working for. And in verse 2, just going back there for a moment, it literally says, they became bold or took boldness in God. Right? So these events made them bold. They were able to take boldness in God. And knowing these things, because of this, they had nothing at all to fear from anyone or any situation. So because knowing this background to it, it makes sense why they would come to Thessalonica emboldened. So let's go back to 1 Thessalonians 2 verse 3. 1 Thessalonians 2 verse 3. because Paul and the others are about to get into some further thoughts on what sort of men they were during their time there. Verse 3, "For our exhortation is not out of deceit, nor out of uncleanness, nor in guile. But as we have been approved by God to be entrusted with the good news, so we speak, not as pleasing men, but God, who is proving our hearts." They got their message from God. It wasn't their own message. And so they deliver it, not to please men, but to please God, the one proving their hearts, which is what they just got done going through in Philippi, a real proving of their hearts and their faith and their trust in God. Verse 5, "For at no time did we come with speech of flattery, as you have known, nor in a pretext for covetousness, God is witness, nor seeking glory from men, neither from you nor from others, being able to be burdensome as Christ's apostles." So Paul gives a list of 8 things they did not do when they came to these people to preach the gospel: deceit, uncleanness, guile, pleasing men, flattery, covetousness, seeking glory, and not burdensome. Now, we're going to take a look at the Greek words for these because they give a little more clarity. In English, some of these sound like they have a bit of an overlap. What's the difference between deceit and guile? That kind of sounds like the same thing. But the Greek word for deceit is plane, which means wandering or straying about. Error. That is, false teachings that stray from the truth into error. Akatharsia is the word for uncleanness, and in this context, it's referring to impure motives. Dolos, the word for guile, means bait, craft, guile, or deceit. In other words, trying to trick them into believing a certain way using the right language. They didn't use craft of speech. They were open, honest, and bold. No fancy techniques for convincing people to come over to their point of view. No psychology. Just straightforward communication. Kolokeia is the word for flattery. It means flattering discourse. And it comes from a word that means a fawner. Right? If you can think of someone who fawns over other people, but falsely, not really meaning the words they are speaking. A manipulator, in other words, telling you nice things just to get you to do what they want. It's not what they were doing. And the next one is I'm not going to try that one. Greedy desire to have more, covetousness, or avarice. This word is interesting because Paul uses it in a particular phrase to mean that he didn't come with ulterior motives for greed, right? He wasn't there secretly looking for money. He wasn't pretending to get rich. The whole phrase used together, a pretext of covetousness, also can mean a cloak of covetousness, which brings to mind a picture of someone who is concealing their true motives behind some sort of covering. Right? They've got a cloak on and they've got a dagger hidden and a smile on their face when they come up to you. No, that's not who these men were. They weren't there to get rich, and they weren't there to get glory from men. Their glory came from God, and that was enough for them. It was enough to simply be spreading the good news of Jesus, the Messiah, the one they'd been looking for their entire lives to grow his kingdom. And what a great honor that is. Verse 7, "But we became gentle in your midst, as a nurse may nurture her own children." They didn't come into the midst of the Thessalonians to dominate them or force them into a certain way of thinking, but rather to nurture them, which is the Greek word thalpo. It means to keep warm, foster with tender care, or cherish. Now, the sense here is fostering them with tender care or looking to their care with almost a maternal concern. Right? If you watch a mother with her child, that's how they were. They genuinely cared about these people. They're not treating them as just sheep to be fleeced for what they can give. We see that all the time with televangelists. Their flock is for the fleecing. Verse 8, so being desirous of you, we are well pleased to impart to you not only the good news of God, but also our own souls, because you have become beloved to us. Okay, so the LSV, the translation I'm using, made some interesting translation choices here. And they're not wrong per se, but they're not quite as strong as they could have been. So here's a slightly different translation that hits the high points without having to get too sidetracked into the different Greek words. So verse 8 again, in this manner, yearning for you, we gladly resolve to give over to you not only the good news of God, but even our own lives, because you have become beloved to us. So it's not a big difference, but it conveys something a little more clearly than the other translation, and it's this. Paul, Silas, and Timothy cared so much for these people, so much for them that not only did they want them to bring them the good news, but they were even willing to give their lives to do that. And the reason they give for this great affection is quite simple. You have become beloved to us. You have become beloved to us. Beloved is one of those English words that doesn't get much use outside of wedding ceremonies, right? When's the last time you used beloved outside of reading the Bible or going to a wedding? No? It's a word formed from the Greek word agape, and in English it means to love greatly or to be dear to one's heart. So Paul and the other two weren't simply fulfilling a mission with these people, treating the good news like it was, treating the good news and their calling like it was a 9-to-5 job, just being casual about it, showing up for a few hours and then they clock out and they go about their business. They not only took the gospel very seriously, which, as the very words and scripture of God, cannot be taken any other way, they also cared from the heart for these people they were ministering to. They loved them and labored for them daily because of their great and deep affection for them. If we see someone who is genuine in their own faith and their concern for others, especially in their zeal for God, it's obvious. You can't hide something like that for very long. The Thessalonians, however, weren't unique in earning Paul's affections. We see this in all his letters. He cared deeply for all of God's people. Even the ones he never met, which the epistle to the Romans testifies to that. He never met the Romans before he wrote to them. So he cared for them. But there's an even deeper layer to what he's saying here, and it comes to surface in the next verses. Verse 9. For you remember, brothers, our labor and travail, for working night and day not to be a burden on any of you. We preached the good news of God to you. You are witnesses, God also, how piously and righteously and blamelessly we became to you who believe. So Paul and the other two openly labored for these people, not only in word, but in literal occupation as well, working with their own hands so as not to be a financial burden. And we learned last time these people were quite poor physically. They didn't have a lot to share, but they did share what they had when they could. Now, on the deeper level, what Paul is saying is that not only did we not take from you, but we gave ourselves. Now, Paul's not describing the way he expressed himself emotionally. This isn't about emotional giving. He's describing faithfulness to the covenant family of God. This is about covenant and faithfulness. We treated you as our covenantal family, even though it cost us. You are our family. Verse 11, even as you have known how we are exhorting each one of you, as a father his own children, and comforting and testifying, for your walking worthily of God, who is calling you to his own kingdom and glory. I forgot to include that. So you are our family, our children in the Spirit, and that's something we were willing to sacrifice for. He calls the way he treated them as a father. Paul and the others were willing to lay down their lives for these people because they loved them as their own family. And here's the next layer. The sort of love and teaching he is describing here would have been quite the contrast with the kind of teachers and philosophers they were used to seeing come through their area. And they had a constant stream. The area was full of traveling philosophers, cultic initiators, mystery religion recruiters, patronage-based teachers, and paid rhetoricians. In fact, just a little way down the road, we see this in Acts 17, verse 19, just a little way down the road, listening to these traveling peddlers of thought was how the Greeks in Athens got their entertainment. This is how they passed their time in Acts 17, verse 19. So, having also taken him, they brought him to the Areopagus, saying, "Are we able to know what this new teaching is that is spoken by you? For you bring certain strange things to our ears. We resolve then to know what these things would wish to be. And all Athenians and the strangers sojourning, for nothing else were at leisure but to say something and to hear some new thing." So these people loved to hear new ideas. They would even pay some of the people traveling by to hear their stories and thoughts. Traveling teachers, philosophers, and the whole kit and caboodle would expect their audience to give them something in return for bestowing their wisdom upon them. These men traveling about were clearly loungers about, simply looking for whatever they could earn with clever words and new ideas. It's easy to fall into the same sort of mindset today as the Athenians, always looking for some new hidden meaning that escapes 99% of the people, right? Secret knowledge, new things to tickle the ear. There was a great heresy that's spoken of elsewhere in the Bible called Gnosticism, the search and the love of secret knowledge. It's a distinguishing feature of many cults. There's different levels, and in order to ascend to each level, you have to earn it, and then each level, there's a new bit of secret knowledge you get, and as you get further and further, higher in the ranks toward the inner circle, there's deeper and deeper secret knowledge. But that's not the way God's truth works. But it's easy to fall into the trap of wanting that. What about giants, or the Illuminati, or aliens? Or what secret thing is happening in Jerusalem? Or the secret railroad running under the earth? Have you heard of that one? I just heard about that one the other day. Or even the shape of the earth. All of these and many more are simply distractions from the truth. Some of them might be true. Some of them might be. But we really have no way to prove it. We can't prove it one way or the other, and the list I just ran through is the short list. The long list of various theories and conspiracies and true knowledge is way longer. Here's another one. Did you know that those going to church on Saturday are part of the secret cult of Saturn? The cult of the black cube? Well, according to many online forums, that's true. However, we're not sitting here because of any cult. Let me rephrase that. We're not sitting here because we're part of a cult. We're sitting here because of the Word of God. While the other things can be interesting to talk about, the reason they are interesting is that we love to hear something new, something different, and most of all, something secret and forbidden. There's nothing inherently wrong with discussing these things, but they are distractions, and they can easily drain our time away from what really matters. The ins and outs of the Illuminati won't really make a difference in the long run to us. We're either in the kingdom or we're not. God's going to destroy it all anyways. We don't have to know about the secret cabal running the world because the Bible tells us about it. It tells us about Satan and his servants who do rule the world. And it's no theory. It's what we're plainly told in Isaiah 8. Now we can speculate, but we have to remember it's a distraction from what really matters. People don't worship God. That makes them inherently servants of the God of this world. And this is true for anyone in power who does not serve our God. They serve a God, and he's the God of this world. So we don't need to look for a secret conspiracy because the Bible tells us about the real ones running everything behind the scenes, the real ruler of the world. But most importantly, it tells us who is going to defeat the ruler of this world in the end. Isaiah 8, verse 12. Do not say a conspiracy concerning all that this people call a conspiracy, nor be afraid of their threats, nor be troubled. Right? If we just spend all of our time digging into conspiracies, it's easy to be overwhelmed with fear. What's going on over there? Oh no, the world is ending. But verse 13, the Lord of hosts, him you shall hallow. Let him be your fear and him be your dread. Right? Now, to be fully honest, I like hearing about a good conspiracy as much as the next person, right? Some of them are fun to hear about. But I do, and so this is not to disparage anyone who is interested in conspiracies. I just have to remind myself they're all distractions and hearsay. It's a game of smoke and mirrors, a web of lies. And if we focus on this hand, we're going to miss what this hand is doing. The only way to stay above all the lies is to focus primarily on God and his word and fear him alone. But that's not the sort of people the Athenians were. They were people who loved to spend all their time listening to the latest thoughts, conspiracies, philosophies, and the type of teacher they would have been listening to is exactly who Paul is contrasting himself with. Verse 3 of 1 Thessalonians chapter 2. Verse 3. For our exhortation is not out of deceit, nor out of uncleanness, nor in guile. But as we have been approved by God to be entrusted with the good news, so we speak, not as pleasing men, but God who is proving our hearts. For at no time did we come with speech of flattery, as you have known, nor in a pretext for covetousness. God is witness, nor seeking glory from men, neither from you or from others, being able to be burdensome as Christ's apostles. In other words, they only sought glory from one's place. All of these traits that we just went through are how the usual suspects rolled through town. They oozed false teachings. They had impure motives. They were crafty, trying to please men. Flatterers, coveters, seeking vain glory. And they did it all for money. It was all for profit. So what Paul and Silas and Timothy are saying is, we're totally opposite to these sorts of men. Right? We weren't burdens, financially or otherwise. We paid our own way, and it wasn't for the glory we might receive from men. We were doing it to please God. And that motivation alone made all the difference to these people. It helped to convince the Thessalonians of the authenticity of their message. They could tell these men aren't out to make a buck from us. It was obvious. The apostles did whatever they had to do to make their message as effective as possible and to keep it from being hindered. Whatever personal comfort sacrifice they had to make. So, here in this first section of chapter 2, we've seen Paul and the others establish and remind the Thessalonians of the example they set while they were among them. And the manner in which they came to them that was so different from what they were used to hearing. It's a huge contrast. They remind them of how much they had to sacrifice to get the good news to them. And they remind them, you are our family. You are our family. Next time, we're going to get into the obligations that being part of the family brings with it. But that finishes up this first section of Thessalonians for today. Next time, we're also going to look at a somewhat hidden literary tool Paul utilizes to make his message just a bit clearer. It's not really hidden if you know what you're looking at, but it's pretty interesting. And we'll do a deeper look at verses 10 through 12 as well, because there's really a lot in those verses once you dig in a bit. And we'll probably spend pretty much all of our time next time going just through those few verses. So, I hope this has been profitable for you all. And if you have any thoughts, comments, questions, critiques, whatever, please feel free to make them, to come tell me. Or if you're online, please write. I love hearing from everyone, and it's good to be here with you all today. I hope you have a good rest of your Sabbath.